If you've been listening to our track record series on the podcast feed, you know I have been going through some old books that I had in my library and trying to find some content to make off of them. Today, I want to talk about one of those little booklets that I found that I think would work best in short format. So this is called God's Answers for Life's Questions, and it's subtitled A Book of Redemption from the Holy Bible. So I found this in my old library, and I want to talk to you all about it today, because this is a pamphlet from Bearing Precious Seed, and it is meant to be evangelistic, the kind of thing you could just hand to someone on the street and have them read and hopefully get saved. And I am not against evangelistic literature. I think sharing our faith can be beautiful and important. But pamphlets like this make claims that I think we need to examine a lot more carefully than we tend to. This particular one promises to give you answers to life's biggest questions with, quote, on the first page, "No words of man, you will only read the words of God," end quote. And then 28 pages follow of King James Bible verses. And here's the thing, the claim that this is no words of man, just the words of God, is fundamentally dishonest, even if it's well-intentioned. Let's talk about why. Hey everyone, I'm Colin, the resident nerd and Bible scholar here at the Bible Uncut and Unfiltered. I want to start with the obvious problem of pamphlets like this. The moment you choose which verses to include out of over 31,000 verses in our Protestant Bibles, you are making interpretive decisions. You are deciding what is important, what is relevant, what communicates the message you want to convey. That is not just God's words. That's curation of them. And curation is interpretation. Note too that they very specifically chose the King James Version. That is a translation decision made by humans in the 1600s with particular theological and linguistic commitments. Other translations render some of the key passages in this pamphlet differently than the King James. So the choice of translation matters, and pretending it doesn't is also misleading. And a third thing is the organization. They have arranged these verses under headings like, who is God? What happened to mankind? Those headings aren't in the Bible. They are imposing a framework, a narrative structure that guides you how to read these disconnected verses. And maybe it's right. I'm not necessarily saying that those headings are completely wrong, even though we will get to that in just a second, trust me. The fact that they are adding them in the first place is theology. It is human interpretation. It is no longer, quote, just the words of God. And we also have to consider the way that they cherry pick these verses. Like if we look at the section on who is God, they include a lot of verses about God being creator and there being no other God like the Lord. Great. But they don't include any of the difficult passages that complicate the portrait. What about Psalm 137, where the psalmist seems comfortable with the idea of a God who dashes babies against rocks? Where are the passages where God commands the destruction of an entire population? Where's the diversity of how different biblical authors portrayed God, like the cosmic judge of Job, the intimate shepherd of Psalm 23, the warrior God of Joshua, the suffering parent and husband of the prophets? By selecting only the verses that fit a particular theological portrait, they are not giving you, quote, just God's words. They are giving you their edited version of who God is. And that's a profoundly different thing. And here's where it gets even more problematic. Their section on what happened to mankind starts with, quote, Satan falls, and then they give verses from Isaiah 14, and the next section says Satan the serpent tempts man to sin, and they give verses from Genesis 3. But as scholars like Michael Heiser have shown, that is reading later Christian theology back into texts that don't actually say that. Isaiah 14 isn't about capital S Satan as we view him today. It's about the king of Babylon. The Hebrew word nakash in Genesis 3 just means serpent. The text never identifies that nakash with the being that we think of as Satan. There is just the Satan. It is a title, a position, not a specific person, particularly in the Tanakh, the Old Testament, but even as we get into the New as well. So they are not just presenting God's words here. They're presenting a specific interpretive tradition and claiming that it's the plain meaning of Scripture. That's exactly the kind of adding to Scripture that they claim to avoid. That is the problem with pamphlets like this. They sound so good on paper, and then if you have a problem with it, they say you're arguing with Scripture and the problem's with you. But we can't just claim, here's only God's words, and totally ignore all of the interpretive decisions we have made to get to this pamphlet that we are now handing to you. Another example of this, they mention the parable of the Pharisee and the publican in Luke 18. They use it to claim that part of salvation is saying, God be merciful to me, a sinner, as the publican did. But if you look at the context, verse 9 explicitly tells us the paragraph was directed at people who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and looked down on everyone else. It's not a salvation formula. The publican was not converting from paganism. He already believed in Yahweh. He was just willing to admit that he didn't have everything figured out, unlike the self-righteous Pharisee of this particular parable. It's a story about humility versus religious arrogance, not a prescription for how to get saved from hell. Ripping verses out of their literary and historical context to make them say what you need them to say is the opposite of letting God's words speak for themselves. And here's the beautiful irony that they completely miss. At the end of the pamphlet, the last page and a half, they include the story of Philip and the Ethiopian eunuch from Acts 8. The eunuch is reading Isaiah, Philip asks him if he understands, and the eunuch's response is, how can I unless someone guides me? That's the whole point. Scripture cannot on its own interpret Scripture. The second that we open up the Bible, we are bringing our own baggage, our own interpretations, our own experiences, often unconsciously, but they are still there, to the text in front of us. These documents we have in the Bible were written over 2,000 years ago in different languages and different cultures addressing different situations than ours. That requires teaching, context, and interpretation. We don't hand students Shakespeare and expect them to get it the first time without any further direction from the teacher. And that was written in English just 400 years ago. How much more so then the Bible, which was written in different languages in a different time and a different place. And even this pamphlet's own final story undermines its central claim. They even condescend to the reader at the end. They say, quote, do you remember on page 3 you read there is no other God than the Creator? I'm sorry, if someone can't remember page 3 of your 31-page pamphlet that is 95% Bible verses with no connective tissue or explanation, that's not on the reader. That's on you for thinking that you could just throw Scripture at someone and have it magically make sense. And don't get me wrong, I am all for evangelism in the right context. I think sharing good news matters, but we can do so much better than this. Just dumping Bible verses on someone and expecting them to understand a complex, ancient, multifaceted collection of texts written half a world away and 2 millennia ago, that's not good evangelism. It's lazy. The gospel is a rich, beautiful, challenging story, and the Bible even more so. It deserves to be told with honesty about our own role in interpreting and presenting it. And when we flatten it into disconnected proof texts that claim we're just presenting God's words with no human influence, we are not being faithful to Scripture. We are being dishonest about how our Scriptures actually work. Sometimes in our rush to get people out of hell and into heaven, we flatten the story of the Bible into something barely recognizable and barely worth reading. We owe both God and our neighbors something a lot better than that.